everyone, and welcome to ZDS 075. Super excited to have L Barrett on the show today. We're going to be talking RxJS and React, how they might work well together, how they might not work well together. We'll find out in the conversation, I guess. But if you're watching, find yourself enjoying the conversation, please consider giving us a like and subscribing, as it really helps out the channel. So thank you so much, and without any further ado, here's Adam. Hey everyone, ZDS 075. Adam, we got you back. How's it going, man?
Hey man, good to be back. I love this show. Long time watcher, and what, second time guest?
Three-time guest, I think. Second, I don't know. We're somewhere up there. Yeah, you're a regular. You're friend of the show, Adam L Barrett. There we go. Yeah. So we were talking before I hit record about tools and stuff. So I just bought a new house, and I was telling Adam about how I feel like I'm not a dad yet, but I'm getting there, like a proper dad.
Right, yeah. And I was saying I'm 44 years old, and I hope to someday be a proper dad. I got the jokes pretty good, and I bought some tools I don't know how to use and stuff, so I'm almost there. I do walk around the house at night turning off lights, which I think is a very important part of being a dad.
Yeah. Yeah, we've been doing some stuff around that. Like, new house means like opportunity for new habits is what I've been trying to focus on. So I was telling you about how, we're just trying to make it so like we don't have to clean up. Like, before, my mom would come to visit, and we'd like spend the 2 days before like in this intense, frantic state of like, it's time to clean, you know? And we've been trying to get to where we're just always in a clean state. Like, every night we do it, or try to even get to every time we come out of a room, make sure it's clean.
Okay, I like where you're going with this. See, me and my wife, we definitely still have the like panic cleaning before people come over sort of thing. Not that people come over these days, but if they do. Yeah. But we got into this thing now. It doesn't sound like we're nearly as advanced as you, but we are like, hey, every Thursday we have like a 2-hour cleaning session, and just by like having this thing like, and we basically do like bathrooms and kitchen and living room sort of cleanings, and do all the floors, and like just that alone. And then you sort of try and keep things steady throughout the week and whatever, and do any sort of major cleaning like dusting and stuff just every now and then. But that like once a week, getting the toilets cleaned and getting the floors washed is like a huge thing for us. We're like, this is so good. It's made everything feel cleaner all the time, rather than like, oh my God, we have to clean. Somebody's coming over, we got to clean. Spit in my mic. Sorry about
that. We didn't notice until you pointed it out.
Yeah, well, now that I have. There you go.
There you go.
Rewind, slow motion it, and just be like, oh, this guy's disgusting. It's true. I am.
No, you're Batman. Batman.
Because I'm Batman. You know, my favorite Batman is actually the one from, have you ever seen Hiji, like How It Should Have Ended? No? Google it.
No, I haven't.
Google it, okay. and I've welcomed you to hours of entertainment. But it's basically a show where they do little cartoons of like how things should have ended, and then they add this Batman and Superman cafe where Batman and Superman just hang out, and it's worth the Google. I've just given you hundreds of hours of entertainment. You're welcome.
Thanks, Adam. Having you on the show is already paying off. Well, so the reason I called you on the show last week, I had Kenzie Dodds on. And we mentioned just in passing, I'm by no means a React expert. I feel like I'm very, very much a novice still. But I'm just like messing around with stuff. And there's some things I'm noticing about React where I'm like, so in Angular, there's places where I reach for RxJS all the time. Like, anytime I have a class property that's going to change, rather than declaring it as a class property, I declare it as an observable of that class property. And that signals to people, hey, this is going to change, and here's how it's going to change. React, I feel like I already have that mechanism most of the time. Like, if something that's going to change, it's like, well, we'll use like useState to show that this will change, or something like that. And so it's like that piece that I normally reach for RxJS is already there for me. So that's kind of where I was going with Kent.
All right, well, let me ask you this.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
so, and this intrigued me, and I texted you on Twitter because of that, because I was like, hey,
yeah,
let me talk you into RxJS with React, because I do think that they complement each other so well. They go together like,
yeah.
I always say peanut butter and chocolate, which is like a Reese peanut butter, which is like fantastic. And so before we get into maybe that, and my whole idea of that is, why do you say, like, as soon as you have a property that's going to change in Angular, you reach for RxJS? You're like, wow, well, I'll put this either in a component store or whatever, like a behavior subject as a service or something. Why do you do that rather than just use like the properties, like the member properties on the class or whatever that you could just update? Because Angular's going to pick it up anyway, right? With the regular change detection, at least.
So I feel like you're leading me into something.
No, I am, obviously. Like, yeah. Wrong,
but the main reason is to write declarative code. Like if I can declare someone, like there's a name at the top that's going to change over time, right? If I can make that as an observable, all the logic for how that's going to change is in one block, localized over there. If I don't do it that way, I end up having a property that's like has changes, places it could change distributed throughout my file, at least throughout my file, maybe throughout my entire code base, which when it's time to fix a bug, that becomes hard.
Let me repeat that back to you to make sure I understand. So what you're saying is, like, in your class, you're going to have one place that sort of like handles all the, like, how can this change sort of thing, rather than it being like, well, in this method, there's a mutation or whatever, there's like a setting on it. And in some other method, 100 lines down, there's another one that like changes it. And then there's another thing that might add something to it or change it in some different way, like a few hundred lines down below that or something. And it's like, why have it all scattered? Why not have one place that just like centralizes, how can this state change? And then I just say, hey, and I read that state from somewhere else, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I just 100% agree with you. Knock something down. Don't worry about that. Hopefully nobody saw that.
I didn't see anything. I heard it. I didn't see nothing. But okay, so it seems to me like there's a mechanism for this in React already. And maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like composing hooks for this would be essentially the same thing. Like useState kind of gets you most of the way there, or you can just say, well, I guess I don't know. I guess in that case, you're just structuring out the setter method. But you could potentially do something where like you have this custom hook that, like, I don't know, maybe takes in some properties to it. And then you can say, okay, so the things we pass into my, use custom property, those are the things that could affect it. If I go into the hook, this is the way it does affect it. And then when I look at my component, like it's all there. So it's the same thing. In Angular I use RxJS, in React I would use hooks. Is what it seems to me.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you. And I get this, and I see where you're going, I think. And I love the fact that you're on the same journey I kind of ended up going down, because it feels like to me that no matter what framework you're using and whatever you're going, you get down to this abstraction that just feels right. And that is, and I'm going to describe the abstraction, and I realize that it's leading, but whatever. But the abstraction is basically something like, you want to be able to just subscribe to the state, and then you just want a bunch of, let's call them actions, but you basically want some functions to call that you can pass data to then change that state. And whenever the state changes, you just want to be told, like, hey, change the display now, the state has updated. Do something, the state has updated. Or even better, derive some new state from that state because that state changed, and then use that as your new state, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I feel like this is where people start to like RxJS, because they're like, hey, that is like a basic, right? That is behavior subject. It's exactly that. It's like some state that you can subscribe to, and then you can sort of like dispatch actions into it. And so you can wrap those dispatching of actions in little functions and then just use those. And so like optimally, the best abstraction you're going to get in React is exactly kind of like you said, something very similar to what's it called? Use reducer. Is that what it's called? Use reducer.
Use reducer seems like a fancy way of doing use state.
Like, it is, right? Like I actually, even in a talk, I even said, like, there's actually nothing you can do with use reducer that you can't just do with use state, because use state has that updater method. Use state does that thing where you can say, pass it a function and you get the current state and then you return the new state. And because of that, use reducer is like just a different way of doing that. That's like familiar if you're familiar with Redux.
Well, my perception, and again, I'm super green at this, but my perception is there's these like hook primitives that's like use state and useEffect and I can't really tell if use memo is like built on top of useEffect or not, but it feels like there's a small set of primitive hooks that you can just build anything else up from.
Right. You
But
know what?
I don't
What's
know.
funny is I think if you look at the actual implementation, the the base one is use reducer, which feels weird, right?
Really?
But yeah, and like
Huh.
use state is built on top of use reducer, and then use ref is built on top of use reducer or use state, sorry. And
Gotcha.
yeah, it's weird that, but
That's
I know
interesting.
in my brain, like use state would be the base one, and use reducer
Yeah.
would just be like a fancy on top of that. It's weird, but if you actually look at the code, it appears to be at least use reducer, or at least it was a long time ago when I looked.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, I agree with you. And so here's where I think RxJS fits in really well. And I'm gonna slip into my diatribe right now.
Yeah.
So feel free to fast forward if you don't like hearing the sound of my voice. Um, but like, so all of these things basically, there's use reducer, or sorry, yeah, use reducer, use state, whatever. They're about setting state, but they all rely on setting that state synchronously. And the reason for that is because React sort of expects you to make your components in a way that's like synchronous renders based on discrete state. So there's state, and they say, okay, we have your state. Tell us what you want to render, and your function component, but your component in general is supposed to say, okay, well, render this, and it's a synchronous render, and it can't be asynchronous, and it can't do anything side effecty or whatever. It has to be like, okay, here's the state based on the current state. Here's what I want you to render,
Here's
and
yeah.
and it has to be item potent, if you know what I mean, because React wants to handle how often it's going to call render, and
Yeah.
basically if you put on
Can you just define idempotence
yeah,
while we're here?
I don't know, can I don't know, probably not, but
I know what
uh,
it means, but I'd be hard pressed
as
to
far
give
as
it words.
okay, so as far as my understanding, as far as I understand, item potent means like I can perform this action again and again and again, and it's the same as if I performed it once. Like I'm going to end up with the same result. I'm going to end up with the same state. So in REST terms, like they say, put is idempotent in the sense
Yeah.
that I can put something and it's going to replace the document with this document, and I could do that again and again, and the document's still the same because I'm just replacing. As long as I have the same values, it's again and again. Doesn't matter how many times you can call it. Whereas like a create is not idempotent because it's like I hit a create action and it created something, and I hit it again and it creates a new one. Oh, I hit it again, it creates a new one. Same with patch. It's not necessarily the same every
Yeah.
time you do it. Actually, patch might be idempotent now, they said, based on the state. Anyway, and so they expect your React components to be the same. If I call this with a certain state, it should always give the same values. It should almost be like I don't want to say pure function. I'm trying to avoid the word pure function because it's not a pure function. It's actually quite an impure function. There's state involved. It's not a pure function.
Yeah.
But they want to be able to call the state whenever they want. They will,
Yeah.
sorry, call render whenever they want. And given a certain state, it should always give you the same looking thing.
Yeah. So I've been working on like a little side project here, Adam, in keeping with like my habits thing. I have this like little app that I made that's like a calendar view, and it will just every day I can come in and click, okay, I did my task, and it'll just show me all these things. And the way I built this component was just it was pure. Like there was given some inputs. Here's some DOM, and that was extremely satisfying actually
Did it
to
have
do
any
in React.
state?
No state. I mean, the only thing that would change how it's completely dependent on its props that got passed in, right?
Okay, well,
So
those are
that's
great.
pure.
Like pure components like that. But somewhere you've got state, right? Like somewhere, whether it's at the top of your tree in the
Yeah,
React app, but somewhere you've got some state, and that's kind of makes that impure. If
right.
that
So
makes sense.
this
But you
is
can have
this
purity within.
right. So the idea would be maybe in my calendar app, my calendar component itself is pure. I think Kent would call that a presentational component. So very easy to test, very easy to do a bunch of stuff with, and it's kind of satisfying to just go into. I think I just have two components: the app component and this calendar component. And right now I'm just hard coding the data to pass into the props into that app component and passing it through.
Well, and
So
and that's really nice when it's stateless, right? Because it just makes
yeah,
it so simple. As soon as you add state, it gets a little more complicated. It becomes unpure. But
yeah,
you know what? You can still have a presentational component that has state. You know what I mean? Like you could have a
mm,
component that, for example, tracks whether it's open or closed. Maybe you have like an accordion or something, and like it's like
Yeah.
these first three are open and this one is closed. And this has
Yeah.
nothing to do with like the outer state that you're showing. Whether it's your domain state is kind of how I define it.
Okay.
This is just about where your server
It's a
states
sovereign
right?
component.
Right. This is a UI component, and it's
Yeah.
tracking UI state, and so it's still presentational. And basically, if you were to refresh and it all went away, it's not a big deal, right? Like that state. So you can still have state in a presentational component, I would argue, which is actually, I'm sidetracking from my own point, but I kind of want to get into like why I don't like the term smart and dumb components or presentational and container components anymore, because they come with all this baggage. And so I'm trying to push in my own little world. I'm trying to push UI components and domain components, because it's not necessarily about server state, but there's this state that is about like, what is your app doing? And then there's this other kind of state, which is like to do with like the screen and what I see. And this is like UI state, and this is domain state, and they should be separate. Anyway, let's not go into that for a second, because I never got to my main point about RxJS yet.
Sorry.
It's okay. It was me. I get easily distracted. And so anyway, all this is based on sort of discrete state changes. So it's like, I'm going to render, and based on my, React says, okay, based on this state, tell me what you want to see. And that's your render function. And then you say, okay, I want to change the state. But it's not like, okay, I changed the state, and now the state is changed. You say, hey, I'm changing the state to this, and React says, okay, I'll let you know when to render next, because it might batch some stuff. It might, decide that you're a lower priority to render. It'll tell you when to render next, and again, give you the state. So again, your render is based on like synchronous discrete states. What do I want to see?
Yeah.
And the only real escape hatch they give you, now we could get into something else, but we won't. The only real escape hatch they give you is useEffect. And they basically say, any effects, anything that happen outside of this component and this render and this like synchronous render based on state, put it in useEffect. And so, okay. And that's what you do. Sorry.
Yeah.
And so in useEffect is where you need to handle anything asynchronous, basically. Anything that's like, oh, I got to go fetch from a server, or I'm going to read from the IndexedDB or something, anything that's not like synchronous at all.
Yeah. So useEffect is kind of like, I'm always thinking of this in terms of Angular. So Angular, it seems like the big difference between Angular and React to me is calling render in React is much more intentional. Whereas in Angular, it seems to almost happen by happenstance as you like flip things. You flip some switches around, and you're just like, I see what you're doing. Let me go churn. Let me call change detection. React, especially like going through Kent's course and like seeing the legacy of it, where you would actually call render when you wanted to do X. It seems like, okay, so this is like giving the programmer the keys from the start to this engine.
But that's just to like let you understand, right? Because you should never call render, right? Like you should never. You don't get to decide when render is called, because React sort of takes control of that. And that's kind of what it offers you, right? It's like, I'll tell you when to render component, and I'll call this function, but you just tell me what you want when I tell you to.
Yeah. Well, so useEffect to me seems like a way of like getting some better control. It's like automating that rendering for the most part, but like giving you some finer control over how it happens. Is that fair?
No,
I don't know.
I wouldn't say so at all.
Oh, okay.
Like just to be like, basically, I think both frameworks want to take control of when to call this render function. And like, there's no official render function or whatever in Angular. It's just like, okay, but it's going to say, hey, I'm going to update based on your template now. So I have state, and I think both of them do it pretty much. I'd say the bigger offering is that Angular lets you hook into that and says, hey, here's a method that says that you're dirty now or whatever. So let's check this. Or, you can switch the change detection entirely to push based. It gives you actually like a finer grain control. Whereas React, it's like, no, you tell us when you want something to change, and we'll let you know when to call render. And especially when you get into concurrent mode with like, async rendering and suspense and stuff, because then it's like, I know you want to render, but I've got other things to do. So I'm actually even just going to hold off on your render for a sec until we've got time for you. And then I'll call your render function. So it's really like React is very much like you don't get to decide. And like the hooks are kind of designed to not let you have that decision making.
Interesting. Okay. That's
And so useEffect is where you need to do everything, because it's like they give you this hatch that like, okay, you need to do something outside, or outside of this rendering that we very much control. Do it in here, and we'll control when that gets called. Even that's the other thing too. React's like, here's our contract. You can do everything in here. You can give me a hint as to when you want this to be called, but I'm going to control when to call it. So it might be immediately after render. It might be asynchronously a while after render, and you don't get to decide. React is going to do that for you.
okay.
The out of that, which I would say is what do you call it? Like a concession on React, is if you use the use layout effect, where they make the deal with you. They say, okay, this one we will call synchronously after render. But other than that, if you use useEffect, and they even say when in the use layout effects, we'd prefer you to try using useEffect first. And if you have trouble, and so it's basically more one of those reality conceits. It's like, it's very much like, there's another one, use imperative handle. There's no reason you should use imperative handle. There's no reason for it to exist in the like theos of the React way or whatever, but it's there because some people made class components that worked in a certain way, and they got that instance of it and called methods on it, and basically did things the not React way. And so they give you use imperative handles so that you can continue to convert those components and do stuff. But you really like, if you're making anything new, use imperative handle. There's no real good use for it. Even the example in the documentation is like a useless example. It's like, oh, you could just take that use imperative handle away and that would still work. And it's like, yeah, it
interesting. You're giving me stuff to research because I've never heard of these things before. So
sorry, those are the weird hooks. Use imperative handle. There's I actually have a talk. If you Google it, React hooks the weird ones is what it's called. It's on YouTube. You maybe get a link or something. Yeah, that's awesome. And I basically do a little talk about those and talk about how useless use imperative hook is, and then some of the other ones that you don't use.
I'll make sure that gets into the links down below. So if you're watching, check down below for the weird hooks. I'll also while I'm thinking about it, we'll also make sure to put your timer example up there. That's the one. Cool. When you had reached out to me, that's the one I was actually looking at from you. I thought was really interesting. So
awesome. So that's my talk. React with RxJS.
I think so.
That one's kind of interesting because if it's the one I'm thinking of, I stole that from John Lenquist.
Yes, you said that. You said that. Cool. You did it. He did it in Vue. You were doing it in React, right?
That's the one. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that's a pretty cool one. I like that one.
Yeah.
Because other people are better than I am at this game. So anyway, back to my original point, though. Okay, so so if you look at useEffect as the way they want you to do anything that is outside of this discrete renders based on discrete states changes, then you sort of see, okay, well, what does useEffect look like? And it's basically, it's a function, lets you do anything you want, and it's going to be called based on the dependencies that you give it. Like you can give it a list of dependencies that says, hey, if anything in here changes.
Is it just diffing those, or is it like checking, did the address of these things change?
It is literally using like an equals. Actually, I think it's using object is, or not object is, whatever. I think it's an equals. There might be something with -0. Do you know the whole -0 thing?
No.
Doesn't matter. Okay, -0 is like a thing in JavaScript.
More things to Google.
Yeah. Anyway, so they recently added some method that lets you like check. It's like equal, except it handles things like nan and nan is maybe the same. It handles the -0 problem. Anyway, it doesn't matter. -0 and 0 are different in JavaScript. Okay, back to something else. Anyway, it is basically just checking equal. So if anything in that the reference of anything in that array that you pass it, the inputs array, or what do they call it, the dependencies array, whatever it's called.
So if an object is a deep copy of itself, but it's a different address, that's going to fire anyways.
Correct. Because that's a new object, and I mean, or a new function. If you like define a function in the render method and then pass that in, that is going to be new every time too. That's a problem people have, because it's like you have to understand what the references are in JavaScript to really like use that effectively. And if you don't, you can get into trouble. But that's why they have that linting rule to help you out with that.
To use effectively.
Oh my God, you are going to be a dad soon. I mean, you're obviously already a dad. You know what I mean.
I'm 6-time dad. I don't know. Why am I doubting myself?
You're going to be a good dad is what I mean. Just kidding.
There you go. There you go.
You're a good dad. I guarantee you.
Thanks. Back to useEffect.
You sold one of your kids, in which case maybe you're not, but pretty sure you didn't. Pretty sure. Just starting rumors, just seeing if it works. Back to useEffect. So useEffect basically it calls this function, and then the great thing about this function is it returns a cleanup function. Oh, and it's going to call this function the first time this component like mounts, and they're kind of getting away from the mounting and unmounting because that's sort of the old nomenclature from class components, but it does basically call it what's like, hey, the first time you need to render, we're going to call this useEffect after the first render.
Not the cleanup function, the actual
the actual render. And then when you unmount, it's going to call the cleanup function, or if anything of those changes, anything in the inputs array changes, it's going to call the cleanup function, and then at some point call the
this sounds very familiar, Adam.
Exactly. Doesn't it?
It's essentially an observer, is that right? No, I guess not. I guess it's kind of like an observable, but using callbacks rather than...
It is very complementary to the observable. And so if you look at like the observable, specifically the behavior subject, but even not the behavior subject, what do we have? We have this thing that you subscribe to, and when you no longer need it, you call the cleanup method, right? Like it's perfect for that.
Yep.
And the great thing about the way this works with useEffect is, excuse me, useEffect basically says, hey, here's all the dependencies you're going to have. Subscribe to whatever state you need to subscribe to, and then we'll unsubscribe when you need to, and let us decide, because it's unmounted or something. And it just fits so perfectly with an observable, because now you can say, okay, what am I getting? And basically, and like I show in that example that you're going to add, if you use useState, you get the set state from that hook, and you use it in the useEffect. You've basically got everything you need to hook up RxJS with React, and it's perfect. And they complement each other so nicely. And what this allows you to do basically is to get out of that synchronous discrete updates. So now you're in a thing where suddenly you have access to asynchronous state, and you could use like async functions and whatever. But if you're using async events and asynchronous state that you want to subscribe to and then clean up when you're done, there's like nothing better than RxJS, in my opinion, right now in the JavaScript market. It's just, there's so much stuff, so much code that it is very complicated if you're using like async functions and promises, and it becomes trivial as soon as you get a handle of RxJS. And now RxJS is not trivial. RxJS is, it's a bit of a mind warp for some people. It's somewhat complicated. And then the operators, this sheer amount of operators and all the differences of what they do can be scary. But once you get it, you can do things like I'm going to give you this example. There's an example where you say, okay, well, my component's going to load up. I'm going to see if there's state that already exists, and if so I want to synchronously like put this in here so that I can say, synchronously I've got state, and then I want to subscribe to any state changes. So if there was no state, if it wasn't ready yet, I still want to subscribe, or if it's going to change in the future, I want to subscribe. And then if it does change, I want to like wait a second. I want to add like a little timer, maybe 500 milliseconds or something. And I don't want to change the state that's currently there yet, because if it does change fast, like I want to say, here's what I want to say. I want to say, I don't want to put a loading state in yet. I don't want to immediately show a spinner. I want to wait 500 milliseconds before showing that spinner. And then, 500 milliseconds has passed. Let's show a spinner. Oh, and now the new state has changed, but the spinner's only been there for like 20 milliseconds. So let's have a minimum for that spinner to stay of like 200 milliseconds, just so it doesn't look ridiculous, like it flashed on and off for no reason. Give it one full rotation in the spin, and then show the new state whenever the state changes. And I want to do that every time state changes, so that if the state is fast enough, you won't see any spinner. If the state takes a little while, you'll see a spinner, but it won't ever just flash. You'll always get at least one full rotation. And if you do that with promises, that actually ends up being a lot of code. It ends up being a lot of checking. And then, and more importantly, if they navigate away or the component gets unmounted, I want to just stop that whole thing, and I don't want to update state anymore, because that causes problems. And memory issues. And if you do that in RxJS, it's trivial. And this is kind of where I get to my endpoint is, so basically you can use React and its built-in hooks, and you use reducer if you like that, or set state or use state most of the time. And anytime you need something that isn't, and that's like a state machine. It's like, hey, I get to synchronously set state. I always re-render based on the discrete state changes. It's awesome. And anytime you need something async, just reach for Rx. And then you get all the cool power of Rx, and you make these custom hooks, like you were saying, where it's just like, that little pattern of always saying use state and then a useEffect, and in the useEffects you subscribe. and in that subscribe, you pass the unsubscribe as the cleanup function. Just wrap
Mm-hmm.
that up in like a function that creates new things and connects RxJS to React. And then you can have all this like crazy complicated stuff where it's like fetching from a store, doing stuff,
Yeah.
whatever, blah blah blah, and you end up with the perfect balance, I think. And I
Yeah.
think no matter what, we get back to that thing that you were talking about originally, where what you really want is you just want a custom hook that's going to give you state. Let's following the use reducer kind of idea. It's going to give you state in the first slot. You're going to deconstruct an array, and that's the state that's always going to be what I'm going to render. And then it'll give you a bunch of actions, that are like literally functions that you can call and pass stuff to then possibly change that state, possibly synchronously, possibly asynchronously. And it doesn't matter because you can do that all in RxJS. And they are perfect for each other that way.
Interesting.
Does that make sense?
I think so. I think so. I think I follow what you're putting down.
And it's like, to summarize in as few words as possible, I would say React is great, and the built-in stuff is great for synchronous updates of state. And as soon as you want anything asynchronous, RxJS is perfect. And such little code to bind RxJS to React in like a perfect way.
Yeah.
And everything you do asynchronous now can be in RxJS. And your component doesn't necessarily need to know either, right? Like, your component is just like, I use this custom hook. Whatever is behind this custom hook is a mystery to me. But
it's a black box.
exactly.
here's the pieces you need. Don't worry about it.
Well, and then we can get into like using React's essentially version of dependency injection, which is context API using providers. You could use that to abstract away everything in that custom hook, so they really like, oh, hey, it could be synchronous, and when I run my tests, they're synchronous, but then I dependency inject this idea of this, asynchronous state changes, and then bang, zoom, Bob's your uncle. Components are easy to test. Your RxJS stuff, you test the way you normally test RxJS stuff, and you just have this like very little code that binds those two together.
Interesting. So I was under the impression, again, forgive me for being the novice I am in React.
You are
but
not
context.
A novice. You're like,
I am. I'll feel.
You're a man with expertise, knowledge in JavaScript who is already into React, and you already know more than a ton of React developers. So I think it's unfair to call yourself a novice anymore. Well, unfair to the real novices who are like, he knows so much more than me, and he says he's a novice.
I feel like I have a weird knowledge set. I feel like, well, I don't know. Right. I feel like I understand JavaScript. I understand TypeScript, I think, very well. But I feel like figuring out how to work with this engine, I don't feel confident in it yet. But putting that aside, context seems to me to be a tool to combat like prop drilling, right? Like just this one. I remember my first Angular app I did. It was like this crazy daisy chain. It feels like it's much more painful to do this in Angular than in React. But to like say, okay, get this input and then pass it down, and then get this input and pass it down, and then when something down at that bottom leaf happens, okay, start going back up. Like start setting that back all the way up.
And this one subscribes to that event, and this one subscribes to that. Yeah, exactly. And
it's
the same
super
thing in React,
painful,
right? But yeah.
Oh, okay. I felt like it would be easier in React.
I think it's easier because of the way, just in my opinion, I think it's easier because in Angular, you feel like the components are very like, these are complete components. There's a lot of files. Like you want this to be done. Whereas React, because it's just like a function, you can sort of, I find it's a smaller mental thing. It's like, oh, I just make another function, and that's, oh, and then I make another function. And sometimes it's in the same file, and sometimes it gets its own file, but it feels less heavy than an Angular component. A React component feels lighter than an Angular component. You might argue that doesn't make sense because they literally end up being like the same-ish. But I find that for some reason Angular components, I think it's the files, the multiple files, and the stuff that gets generated for you makes it feel heavier.
I feel like I would not be opposed to just like inlining a React component. I would never dream of doing that in Angular. It's like I would be very hesitant to put more than one component in the same file in Angular. In React, it seems like, well, it's probably better in many cases where they're all in the same file, just because
why not, right? That's
Yeah.
because it's just
And
a function, and like it's like the way you currently split up functions. You're like, well, I have a
yeah.
function. I'll just take this piece that's kind of gets its own name, and I'll put it somewhere else, and I get this piece, and then you get a nice little story in your function.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's not a line of code thing either, which is interesting. Like there's just the whole thing with the component. So if you're not familiar with Angular, like Angular is a component is this class, and it's got this decorator of all its metadata at the top. And it's like this whole pomp and circumstance around building a component, to the point where I feel like I often like jam more things than I should sometimes into one component, just because I don't want to go through the process of making a new class, writing down all those things. And in Angular too, you're I want to say maybe I wanted to say polluting the DOM. Maybe that's not the right word, but like each one of these components is an actual tag that's going to appear in your DOM, which is going to mess up your styles, potentially mess up some other stuff. Whereas in React, it feels like, I don't know, it feels like much more
the fact that you
light.
can have a component that doesn't render anything except subcomponents, right?
Right.
That's one of the most beautiful things about React that like the other frameworks just don't have, right? Svelte doesn't have it, Vue doesn't have it. They all have that like custom element thing that gets made, right? But React has this like null element. It's like I just hold things, and I'm not even specifically talking about fragment, but just a component that has,
well, context is kind of this, right? Like,
well, then not even that, but just like a component, and all it does is it like consumes another component. Like I have a custom component called my component, and I pull in a component called Zach's component, and I render it. And now Zach's component is the one that actually makes like a P tag and an H tag, or H1 tag, But my component just renders Zach's component, so it doesn't add anything to the DOM. Like that's a really cool thing that allows for a lot of cool stuff that you don't really get in any of the other frameworks.
One of the biggest things is like looking at like Angular Materials, an interesting project because they do all this. It's like like you ever see those things in the movies where it's like the laser grid and like the crazy gymnast like does all the flips to get through it.
Like Catherine Zeta-Jones does that thing in that. Never mind. If you don't know that reference.
We just watched Doctor Who, and like one of the characters in that did it. But anyways, like that's what brought it to mind. But that's literally what they're doing to make these like very simple like button components, and make them accessible. And it's like it's crazy. Like it's very impressive what they're doing for sure. But like to make an accessible button, it would be kind of nice to just be like, here's my button, And this is like a huge thing I see a lot of like component library kind of things struggle with in Angular, just because there's so much stuff you have to. You almost in some situations you almost have to like recreate the entire web API for buttons to get an accessible button, which is rough. So I don't know.
I don't even know what we're talking about anymore, but I agree wholeheartedly with everything you said.
Well, so just the fact that it all gets stripped away in React, it's like, well, making your own custom button, that seems pretty easy.
Oh, I know. I know, right? And just like I'm going to add behavior without adding more elements. It's just
nice. Exactly.
Super nice. What were we talking about though?
I don't know. Let's see. We were talking about context.
Oh yeah,
prop
context.
drilling.
That was the thing. Because you said context is like it solves prop drilling, and I think at one point I even said context has one single use. It's to solve the prop drilling thing, but that's not entirely true because it has a second very, very important thing is it is React's dependency injection, right? Like it is, that's how you do it because I say basically, I get to make this component, like I said, that use context is kind of a funny thing. Use context is the hook that takes a context and then therefore based on where it is in the tree will give you a different value based on what context it is, which is
So if there's
context.
If the same component is up here in the tree and the other component is down here in the tree, they're going to they're going to crawl up the tree to get their closest context and use that.
And I mean, we can imagine it crawling up the tree. It actually doesn't crawl up the tree, but essentially it's going to say like, what's my parent context, or if it has one at all, because you can also put a default value that says like, and if they don't have one, use this, which is an important thing too for like testing and stuff, because
that seems a pain to figure out stuff with context and text, as you just have to set your own context each time, huh? But,
That's an interesting side thing. Can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah, let's do it.
So there's this thing that people do. So like they get really frustrated because, and I agree, it's a frustrating situation when you have anything that's using context. Let's say, and specifically, I want to say use context in a React component.
Mhm.
You have to then in your test like provide that context, and so you get these tests that are like, oh, I have to, my component that I want to test right now has like three, down the chain, three different things that I have to provide context for. And so I need to wrap this in like three different providers, mock providers, to even just run this test. And it feels like, wow, I need to have a lot of knowledge about the internal workings of this component to test this correctly. And that feels very wrong, right? It does. It's wrong. Like you shouldn't need to know about you're testing this component. You should only need to know about this component. If it consumes other components, you shouldn't have to worry about those tests, right? And I get that. So I have this idea, but people don't like it. But like I said, you can provide a default thing that says if I don't have any context, like if I don't have any provider providing this value for me, use this default value instead. And a lot of people will just say, make that undefined and check for that. And if it's not defined, throw an error right off the hop. So it's just like, you can't use this without a provider. I think that's a bad choice because that leads to this testing problem. What I think you should do is put a mock thing in there right away. So put your mock context as your default context. And then you don't have that problem anymore because now I'm testing this component and it internally uses some component that needs a provider, but it's using its mock stuff. So it just like, oh, it won't throw an error. It'll behave presumably as expected because it's got this mock context. The problem people don't like is they're like, well, what if you accidentally deploy without a provider? Then there'll be no test error because the tests will work and you'll be pushing out. And I go, yeah. Yeah. You could write something complicated that checks, you could literally write a end-to-end test that says if user is test user 1, immediately say, hey, this test failed or something. There's ways around that. But I think the problem that it really solves is a clean code problem. I shouldn't need to know the internal workings of this component. I just want to test my inputs to it. I want to test it like, I want to give it props. I want to make sure that it renders what I'm expecting. And I want to be able to possibly push buttons and stuff in it. And I want to make sure it calls actions I'm expecting. And you don't have to worry about providing it with these internal things that you shouldn't know anything about anyway.
Interesting.
So that's my opinion on that. Most people don't like it, but I think it's the only reason the only downfall I can find is, yes, you have this possibility, and it's a weird possibility, but it's a possibility that you would then push out code that didn't have a provider because somebody deleted it not knowing what it does or something. And tests would continue to pass. And I just think you can write tests that will fail in that situation. You can either use that you can use those things that say, when I'm building for production, take me out of here and then test in production or something. I don't know. Or if I'm only in dev mode, I don't know. If I'm in testing, don't render this code that provides the default value and then it will throw an error. I don't know.
Well, there's a couple things about that idea that immediately grate on me, and the first one was, I think you've hit on, which is, we could potentially have a situation where we're breaking and it's not very apparent that we're breaking, right? The other thing that drops out to me is I always want to make sure I never code my actual implementation for a test. If that makes sense. So like to put a mock, to have a dependency on the mock thing as a default value seems that immediately grates on me. Like there's immediate friction there.
Tell me why. I don't understand why. Why is there friction there?
Well, so I have similar thoughts. Like it's kind of convenient to, if you're doing end-to-end tests or a unit test or anything like that, and this is in Angular too, just like put some like directive on your element that like e2e symbol equals something, and then you can easily find it, right?
Right.
I don't like, part of me really doesn't like having that on in my actual implementation. Like I want these things to be modularized, where I have my actual implementation and it shouldn't care if it's being tested or not. Like it should just be. And then the testing should be something that is, if I want to do tests, I'll bring that module on top of things and say, okay, let's put this under test, and then completely I can take one part off and it's fine. That's as soon as you do that, I feel like there's some very tight coupling going on in there. Maybe that's the right word. So I don't know.
Tight coupling to some sort of test thing.
Yeah,
that might be there.
So this,
like the data dash test attributes you don't like because it feels like I'm putting this there specifically because it's for testing, not because it adds anything.
Yeah, your test system is now unnecessarily hardwired into your implementation. That's kind of the.
But it's not really, right? Like I agree that would rub me the wrong way. But like data dash test attributes, for example, are not like they don't couple you to any test system. They're an attribute by which somebody can find something, but it doesn't really. It's almost just like a dead attribute. It's almost like putting data dot Zach's thing equals something. You know what I mean? Like it's here's a dead attribute that something may use if they decide to, but it's like a hook. Actually, it's exactly what it is. Not a React hook, but like what we used to call a hook before React stole the word. It's a hook into the implementation. It's like, hey, this is here. If you want to program around it, it's part of the open API, but I'm not going to implement anything on it, but it's here for you guys to put something in.
Gotcha.
And so I feel kind of the same way about adding this like mock weird default value. You can think of it as like, this isn't for testing. This is literally what the app does, unless you provide it with a provider. This is literally what the component does. Unless you provide it with a provider, it always shows test user 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, that is its function. And you have that in like, let's say like a sandbox. Like a storybook or whatever.
Yeah.
That's what it shows user 1, 2, and 3. That is its function. But if you wrap it in a provider, it uses that data instead of this data. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of a hook into it more than it is. And so you're allowing the outer stuff, which it's not that the test is coupled to it. It's more like the test is that's the hook that you gave it.
Yeah, no, you're making me come around to this idea actually. Like, I'm trying to think of like an analogy.
It's kind of like a plugin. Here's an analogy. It's kind of like a plugin, right? If you have a system that allows plugins, you basically give somebody, a hook or whatever to like, okay, well, when this happens, you guys can do something. We're not going to program this. It's going to be a no-op in our thing, but you can use a plugin to put in there. And you're like, cool. And you're kind of putting in the test plugin will use that API. Or in this case, the test plugin will provide new data rather than the data that you have by default.
Yeah. Well, did you have a Sega Genesis by any chance?
I did.
Oh, nice. So this analogy might work then. Do you remember Sonic and Knuckles, the game?
I do.
Okay, I Sonic. To those who don't know, like this is back in cartridge games of video games, and like you would there's this game called Sonic and Knuckles, which was a cartridge that had itself a cartridge slot on it, right? And like so you could play the game and like I think you could like put the shield up and like you could just play the game by itself, or you could like take a plugin like what you're talking about, take Sonic 2, I think you could put it in there and you could replay Sonic 2 as the new character, right? So it's kind of this idea.
I don't remember that, but that is friggin' awesome.
It was so cool. There's like there's also like for Sega Genesis there's also this system called the 32X that was the same idea.
This is where I thought you were going to go. Honestly, this is where I thought you were going to was the Sega CD and the 32X, which basically you keep the Sega Genesis and you just plug the 32X in it, and now you've enhanced your game. Yeah,
exactly. Well, there's this whole thing called like the Sega Tower, because you could they took this idea many different ways. So you could do the 32X, you could do Sonic and Knuckles on top of that, and like you could just keep stacking it. And Game Genie was also part of this stack.
Yeah, throw a Game Genie in there, have a Sega CD slide in on the side. I totally could picture this thing in my head.
Yep,
that's awesome.
Yep, you Google it sometime. It's kind of neat, just like the 90s Sega stack or something like that, and it's pretty cool. But
so yeah,
it's the same idea. Yeah,
there you go. It's not tightly coupling to the 32X.
Yeah,
it's like allowing you to push that in.
Yeah. No, it's not that it's allowing you to push it in. It's like allowing you to work entirely as desired, even if that thing never existed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
that's what's kind of making me come around to it. But yeah.
You know what we were talking about a long time ago?
What's that?
RxJS.
Oh yeah. Well, okay. Let me take you here. I feel like unfortunately, Adam, I still feel like I'm not comfortable enough to form a solid opinion on a lot of your spiel. I feel I will come back to it once I get a little
How
further
dare
against
you,
course.
sir? How
But
dare you?
okay, let me take us this way, because I just did my little calendar, and I have like if you go to zachderose.dev, that's in Angular. Yeah, go over there if you want. I don't know, I don't care. But if you go there, like, it's one of the things I'm most proud of is things will update live. Like if I publish a new blog, like it'll like animate in on the blog page, and I like I go onto people's streams, I'm like, hey, look at this, instead of a link, and then I'll like publish a new blog and it comes in, I'm like, ah.
So how do you do that?
Firebase. I mean, it's not super fancy, but it's Firebase, and you get the subscription then of the server state, kind of. I mean, it's not exactly that, but it's essentially it's a WebSocket and saying, okay, there's a new document added event that got pushed to my client, and I just update my state, and this is an Angular world, and then the component gets that piece of state from the selector and says, okay, let's throw something new in the list, right? I really like that about my site. I'm trying to think, well, how would I do this in React, right?
Oh, well,
And so this is
allow me to help.
yeah. Well, so before we get into like how it would actually work, because I imagine there's like some cool stuff we could do here. This seems like a really perfect case for RxJS to me in React as well. Like going back to like my original point, like in Angular, it's great because this is the way you can better define properties that change. But RxJS is also very good at push architectures. Like it's like, to me, an observable is like a timeline. I think that's the best way of thinking about it. Marble diagrams are also very good, but it's like there's the start event that happens. That's like the start of the timeline. That's what happens when you subscribe. Some events, time passes, maybe events get emitted. Each one of those is like a little node on this timeline that has some information attached to it. Then you have the end, which is the complete. And that's perfect for these push kind of architectures where you have like essentially like a WebSocket, if you're not familiar with Firebase, and you're just like, oh, I got a new event from the server. Let's make something happen. Right. So it seems like this could be a really good case for RxJS in React. I wonder if this is the same benefit you're talking about when you talk about like, it doesn't matter, a synchronous or an asynchronous event happening somewhere up the stack or up the tree. So
Yeah,
is
exactly.
it the same thing?
It is for sure.
It is.
So
Okay.
you can basically say like, and I agree with you. This is a perfect use case for RxJS. Firebase, even there's somebody has a library that's like Firebase RX or something.
Yeah, there's RX Fire, I think.
Right.
So.
And so again, perfect use. And so yeah, essentially you'd have this like component, and all it does is it through its context, let's say, just to like keep it easy, it's going to get a list of articles or whatever, right? And it's going to display them, and it's going to animate them in, and that's all it does, right? And you can test that, and you can say, this is like a custom hook, get use articles, let's say, or something. And so it doesn't know where its data is from. So in the storybook sandbox that you've made for it, it just like provides those synchronously. It's like, hey, you start off with these, and so you would just watch them animate in. You're like, yep, that looks right. Make sure the styling's right, whatever. And then in the maybe you have a little animated. Maybe you don't make it synchronous. Maybe it's like, okay, it's going to wait a sec so you can see the loading, and then it's going to provide the value. You can make that really easily as like the default mock function or whatever. And then all you do then is, for RxJS, you have, like I said, you use that useEffect and the state setting, and you use that in a custom hook, and then you provide that using provider, and in a way that is probably too hard to describe right now.
It's hard to do some of these things.
Hard to describe by waving my hands around dramatically. But yeah, you basically like provide that instead, and then immediately your function gets hooked up to RxJS, and this is where it like leaves React. And this is kind of maybe like the sub point that people are like, well, that's not an important point, but it really is. It's like React really can just be your UI layer. And now I like outside.
That's exactly
of React,
how I feel about Angular, actually.
Right. So. Yeah, right. And I feel like this is the key that binds it all, right? RxJS. Because if using RxJS makes our components simpler, and then we just do all our app stuff like that has to do with what I call domain, like the domain stuff that involves, and it's not purely UI stuff, using RxJS, then you could literally swap out React for Angular and not much changes, right? Like those components change, but the rest of the program kind of stays the same. And honestly, in my opinion, it's that this stuff that like is not going to change that often too. Like I find like there's more like, oh, we need to change the styles, we need to add a button, we need to add features of the components, but a lot of the like core of the app doesn't change nearly as often, and when it does, it's usually much easier. And then you've got this like abstract thing that you can like run tests on, and
Yeah.
you don't need to run UI tests on. You don't need to use Cypress or something to do this. These are very simple unit tests almost.
Yeah.
It's just like, hey, I have this state, I call this action, now I have new state.
Yeah.
Super easy
Well,
stuff.
one of the things that like really stood out to me of a lot of Kent's content, I don't think he really mentioned this while we talked last week, but he talks a lot about how a lot of different frameworks are full of domain specific knowledge or domain specific language kind of thing. Whereas like Angular, so I'm thinking Angular templating is like there's a whole bunch of rules. Like you need there's like Adam, I think you had this not too long ago when you were at Narwhal. It's like here, take this huge book of you figure it out, And I feel like I don't feel like I'm getting that going the other way to React. Like I feel like everything about the calendar component I made for this side project, it was essentially like sugared string manipulation, like sugared very straightforward string manipulation with JavaScript, and that's all it felt like, which was really cool actually.
Right.
Like there's
think
nothing
I get what you're saying.
I needed to learn.
Let me repeat this back to you to see if I understand what you're saying. But you're basically trying to say like there's less to learn in React. There's like a smaller API. Like when you think about it in maybe not technical terms, but like there's a smaller amount to learn, but you seem to be able to get the same amount of stuff done. Or no? Am I reading that wrong?
I wouldn't go that far. I'd say maybe React feels very JavaScript to me. Like if you know JavaScript, React is going to come easily. I don't know.
I definitely agree with that. Like, when you get into like maps, I'm going to map over an array and I'm going to just return an individual component for that. And I'm just going to do stuff in a function and I'm going to return this stuff. And especially if you know what the JSX maps do, like if you understand that, you're like, oh, it really is just calling functions and passing stuff. And the end result is literally a JavaScript object rather than, an Angular template where you're like, well, the end result is a mixture of the compiled template mixed with the, the end result is a black box that you really don't get to see.
Yeah.
Well, the compiler will take care of that for you.
Yeah. So like looping, or I guess looping, let's just talk about it in that context. Looping in Angular is like using the ng4 directive. And just like it's like the only thing I have available to me is the for loop, and it's like this very specific, very constrained. It feels like language that I don't feel like anyone has like a really good grasp on. It's like the more you deal with it, the more familiar you get, and you can get like pretty good to the point where I genuinely do like Angular templating for the most part. But I think a lot of that's familiarity versus coming into React. I was like, oh, I like functional, I like map and reduce and that kind of stuff on arrays. Let's just do that. It felt like there was nothing new to learn there. It was just JavaScript, right?
Yeah, and for me, it's not even the templating because people are like, oh, but like a for loop in a template, that's not too hard, and an if loop in a template, that's not too hard. For me, it was things like. So, like in Angular, you put in the directive view child, or sorry, not the directive, whatever it would be called, like view child, and you have to use it to like get at the underlying DOM that you're pulling in from somewhere else.
Yep.
And it's like with that in React.
That's all very contrived in my opinion too, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking like in React, it's like really easy, right? Because it's like you get a reference to the element, like the H1 element, and then you just use it like a DOM. Like you now literally just have that DOM object, and so you have to do something with it. And I find it was just an easier like, oh, use ref. I get that. I understand that. Than trying to like learn the, okay, in that case you got to learn this. And there was just so much more to learn. It was like, oh, okay, well, if you want to have your component in this component you got to learn something else. If you want to have
content
something
projections and
right,
content children and all that stuff.
and then what were some other things that I ran into? It was like
ng templates. That's another fun one to
like
get through.
like sort of like passing a template into a component that's expecting a template so that it can render something new.
Yep.
It's like a whole different thing you need to learn. Whereas in React, it's like, oh, you just pass it as a prop. Just pass a component as a prop. You already know this. It's like, oh yeah, I guess I already know this. Yeah, it's I would say React is more elegant than Angular in that sense.
Maybe. I'm not ready to jump onto that trade yet.
I'm not expecting you to betray your people, but I'm just saying I think
I'll have to redesign the shield.
The React API is more elegant in that sense, but I'll say it.
Maybe.
But, yeah.
Maybe. I do feel like, so in some ways I feel like it much more matches my aesthetic that I'm like coming to by myself, even in Angular, which is like, don't use classes. Like in Angular, you kind of have to use classes, right? But like, use functions. Like, just use functions. Don't use new. Don't use get. Don't use set. Don't use decorators. Just like have functions and like return objects. And you got TypeScript to define all that stuff for you. Don't worry about defining a class. You got your interfaces. You can just say, here's the shape of that object and define your rules that way. But and use closures if you want to do something with like mutable objects. So
there's a lot of people who like React class components more than the functions, though.
Really,
and I'm just so with you. I just like the functional style. Just like it got me. I was like, I get this. Like, what do you want to see based on this state that we're giving you? Or props in this case, and props and state. What do you want to see? I get that. I'm like, I totally get this. And like combining stuff and like you said, mapping and reducing and stuff, that all just like fits really well with me. But there's a large amount of people that I've talked to who are like, oh, we never switch to hooks because we really like the component. Because it's such I think in my head at least, it's kind of an easier mental model. You like, I have a tree of dependencies. Each of those like things say like, what are my children? And those are just a tree of instances, not dependencies. Sorry, I have a tree of instances, and on those instances, it's going to call render, and you can do whatever you want in those instances. I sort of get that. It's sort of like less complicated to explain like where the state is. The state is in the instance. You just have to. The only thing is you have to like tell them you're mutating it by using set state rather than mutating it directly. That's like the only like tricky trick up. Other than that, it's a very simple mental model. Whereas like, oh, it's your state is held somewhere else, and based on when this is called, it'll reflect to a different piece of the tree. That's kind of maybe a harder mental model to get, like this context that has nothing to do with the word this, which is what like hooks are. That's a harder harder to understand, don't you think?
Yeah, I think
but
so.
It got me. But some people are like, oh, I hate it. I know what this means. When I'm saying this is this instance of the component. Yeah. And it's like, yeah, but it's kind of like this. It's just like use state and you get that state. You just don't get access to the word this.
Yeah. I don't. Yeah. I much prefer, I think, the functional side of things. In Kent's course, he actually will take you through in the earlier modules and show you, okay, this is how things used to work with the classes. And it's interesting to see that, and it's interesting to like kind of extrapolate from that. I feel like I do this a lot because I just came into the game later, starting with JavaScript about 4 or 5 years ago now. There's a lot of history to learn about stuff, right? Like,
do you think learning the history helps you understand why we're doing stuff better now? Or
a little, I think.
Or is it more just about seeing old code and going, now I know what they're doing?
Yeah, it's like there were definitely times before I like looked into a lot of the history. I was like, why in the world are we doing it this way? And then once you learn the history, it makes more sense. I don't know if that's a good thing though. Like in some ways, it's kind of nice to have that perspective. And like so junior engineers out there, if you're seeing something and you're like, what is going on with this? Like, say it, because the more you're into it, the blinder you get to like these little habits you develop of like, well, that's just the way it is. Like, if it could be better, let's make it better.
I was thinking in a related way, like about a year after hooks came out, I was saying to people that I worked with at the time that like we should stop teaching React with class components entirely. Teach first with hooks. and then like later on say, and you might run into some class components later.
That's exactly how Kent does his course,
yeah,
by the way.
And I think that's the way definitely now, however many years it's been now since hooks first came out. But at the time, people didn't want to do it. They're like, oh, every example on the internet still has classes. But I think we've reached that point now where there's so much content for hooks out there now that hooks obviously is the right way to teach, I think now, at least in my opinion. But some people are like, no, you should like start from like the beginning of React when there like before there were classes and talk about like mix-ins and whatever, and then go to classes and then go to classes to hooks. And I'm like, that sounds exhausting, and I don't think it would do any good. But
there's like this thing with MMOs where it's like the older players who are playing now, they want for the new players to have to go through all the stuff that they went through to get to where they were at. I feel like that's the desire that you're talking about here with people.
Is it kind of like hazing? You know what I mean? Like if you join a fraternity, it's like that first week of hazing. Well, we all went through it, so you got to go through it. I get to do it to somebody now. It's like, but it's horrible. It's cruel. Yeah, but we all went through it, so it would be unfair.
You literally could have just told me this in an hour. That would have been fine. No.
Yeah. I find that a lot of the people who are like saying, oh, you need to learn fundamentals. You need to learn the fundamentals before you jump into a framework. I feel like that's the same kind of idea. It's like, do they need to learn fundamentals? Like I encourage learning fundamentals, but not at first. Like I think hop in with a framework, make cool stuff, change colors, look at cool websites and go, hey, I'm pretty good at this. I wonder how this JavaScript stuff really works underneath. Yeah. That's in my opinion, but
I think like the best way is to just get your hands dirty with something. Like just go out and build something. And then like, I played basketball growing up. Go out and play, go out and play and have some fun. And just like do stuff. And if you get really invested in it, as I did in basketball, then okay, now it's time to start learning. And then you like work on your fundamentals. And
exactly.
But while you work on the fundamentals, you're still playing. Like you're still doing stuff. If you're, I don't want to insinuate that you should be coding out of work if you don't want to. But like it should be fine to just do some stuff without knowing everything, and then use the learning you get to enhance that interest you're developing. I don't know.
I mean, developing as a career is such a weird thing, right? Because there's so much changes all the time that we're constantly learning. Like I've been doing this for as long as I can remember, like something like 13 years now, and like I'm still, I'm still subscribed to Egghead.io because I learn new things all the time there. You know what I mean? I'm constantly taking these courses and watching videos and like the Kent C. Dodd stuff that I think is great content. Like there's never enough. Like I'm never gonna be like, and I know it now. Now I will do my job because I have learned. You know what I mean? Like,
it's like okay, done. Now I can write my Hello World app. Now it'll be perfect.
It'll be the most perfect carousel anyone has ever seen. That's kind of a personal joke, but I've rewritten like 5 carousels over my life. Like what do you call them? Like sliders or whatever. Different words for the same widget.
I don't know. I feel like I don't know. I've been thinking about this a lot. I feel like in some ways, as I've gone along, I almost wonder if like I feel like my quality goes up. I feel like my speed goes down, and I'm a bit worried about that. Like I used to be able to pump these things out, and this is all memory, so it feels like just from my perception, it's like, well, those weren't too bad. I'm sure if I actually looked at the code, I'd probably just be like, oh god. What was happening?
I do think there's a little bit of like, you get to a point where, and I'm definitely knees deep in this point right now, but you get to a point where like you are taking too long. Like it's like, I really do want to like follow best practices. And it's like, you probably could have cut this out a lot easier. But at the same time, I would love to see a measurement of overall speed, like a speed that's like takes into account when you built it, how many bugs it had, how many other people had to like fix those bugs and work on your code, and how long it took to add a new feature later on. Because I feel like those first things that like cut out quickly are the hardest ones later on for everything else. Take a lot longer. Whereas like if you hear all these teams when they started good, like they're like, oh, we had a greenfield project and we got started good. Everything goes faster, longer until then that starts to overwhelm itself too, because there's this complexity thing that always happens. But.
So Kent and I were talking about Rich Hickey's talk, Simple Made Easy, last week. Yeah, you've seen that talk?
Oh yeah, for sure. So
Yeah.
everyone should see it. Required viewing for all developers.
I'll throw it again in the links. It's yeah. I was telling him it kind of like changed my life beyond just code. It was like
And it introduced me to the word complect, which I
yeah,
love.
complect.
Yeah.
So
Like,
complect for those of you listening, if you think about braiding hair, if you have some strands and you twist them, one of those twists would be a complect. You are complecting your strains, and when you're braiding, you're doing it on purpose. In coding, we also kind of do it on purpose, but to our detriment, which is kind of the point of his talk. Which, yeah, it's really changed the way I think about code,
and
the
it
way I
was
think
really about
life.
maybe you're
Yeah,
repeating what you already did with Kent, but
yeah,
it was very much about like easy is not necessarily simple, and like having something done quickly and because you're used to it is maybe or a library provided it doesn't actually make it simpler. That just like possibly hides the complexity that's coming later, maybe
yeah.
possibly.
Yeah, and there's the graph there that goes exactly into what we're talking about. Where like if you take an easy but complex approach, you have the screen field that like starts out really quick, and then over time you just like degrades your speed again and again until you're like at a crawl. Versus if you go with some a very simple approach, but it's hard, right? Like you actually get to this place where your code base remains simple as you keep pushing, keep developing, but your team is going to start learning it better. So instead, you have like this upward trend in your code base. So that definitely, like especially for long-standing code bases, it seems like absolutely the kind of approach you'd want to take. But maybe getting back to some of what you were saying too, Adam, I actually find that like it would be really cool to have those kind of metrics where you could actually say like, here's our speed, here's a number for that. I actually feel like there's so much resources wasted on trying to get to that metric because I feel like that's, I don't know. I feel like trying to distill that down to a science or to a discrete number is kind of like a foolish endeavor at the moment, and maybe always will be.
Do you know
I don't
anybody
know.
trying to make that endeavor? See, this is the thing is I don't even know of anybody that's even trying to like have an overall speed.
Well, I think in general, like that's the goal for a lot of larger companies who do like burn down charts and like very integrated with Jira and this kind of thing, trying to track. At the end of the day, it's like trying to track that speed. I think, and it's
yeah,
always
but
seems kind of silly
in my
to me.
experience, most of those do not take into account like refactoring and features. Like it's mostly just like we have a number that this is the features, and so now we add more features, and that's our velocity is how many features can we get in. But they don't really take into account like this guy
Bugs.
did it right and therefore had like everything that came after his that was around his features were easier as opposed to this guy who did it quickly, got a bunch done, and now everything we do afterwards is longer and longer. Like I don't see anything trying to get that measurement.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that's even harder to do, right?
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean. Like it would be super hard. I don't know how somebody could do it, but it would be super valuable if you could crack that nut.
Oh, for sure. There was some interesting stuff. I saw this. I forget who it was. If I find it, I'll put it in the links down below. But it was looking at this kind of analysis of code bases, just to see like I think it was looking at mainly at like if you have these different people working on your code base and you lose one, like what's the impact of that? Like they decide to take a job somewhere else or something like that. So I don't know. It was kind of attempting to do what you're talking about, where it's like, okay, let's. I think it was actually in the context of like trying to identify problem spots in a code base to like refactor to make them better. Like this is clearly a bottleneck would be the idea, right?
Right.
So I don't know.
Maybe not down to a person, but an area in the code, which to be honest is definitely the better way to go. I focus too much in my little blathering there about like this guy, that guy, but actually it's about more like this code I wrote today is great. This code I wrote yesterday because I was in a bad mood and under pressure is awful. Yeah, no. more about less about the who wrote it and more about like this area of the code sucks and needs to like be fixed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting to try to figure that out, some objective measure. I see a lot of waste around, like trying to do similar things, and maybe because it's going about it the wrong way. If there could be something that was like, oh, I don't know, like even getting to like associating changes in the code to bugs is like getting, you have to have this integrated ticket system integrated with your code base and all this stuff, and that in itself is like enough resources. I'd be like, I'm done.
I wonder if somebody like has a service that you could pay for that does that. I bet you it exists. I don't know what it is, but I bet you there's some sort of service that's like, we'll analyze your code and then we'll look at your issues and we'll connect them. We'll be like, this is because of these commits that you made earlier are causing these bugs later on.
Yeah, or these files or something like that.
Yeah,
it'd be interesting.
I bet you there's a service. I don't know what it is. If there isn't, $1 million idea there. Let's roll it.
That's someone else's $1 billion idea.
RxJS for a second.
Yeah.
Complexity I was going to get into, like over complecting and simplicity. This is kind of where that beauty lies, right? Is that if you can have a component, and this is your UI component, and it uses, like I said, a custom hook that pulls in from somewhere and like may or may not be attached to RxJS and may or may not be synchronous or asynchronous, but it's just like, I just render when I have, and when I want to change something, I call these functions. Once you have that, that's a super simple setup. And you have this like component that is easy to test, easy to understand, and then you connect it to something else that is also simple, because it's like, okay, as soon as you get observables, you get them. They're like, okay, I have a bunch of derived values. I call, I dispatch actions to change those values, and it kind of goes through these pipes.
I'd actually argue with you on that point, Adam. There's so many false summits to understanding RxJS, I feel like.
False summits? Define false summits. I don't know what you mean.
Like, I felt like I understood RxJS, like you were talking about, and then I was like, wait, what's a cold observable? And what's a hot observable, right? Like we had some of these conversations at Narwhal, like, what is going on here? and just other ways.
That kind of gets into, oh man, I could talk forever. But that kind of gets into this whole idea of like accidental complexity and what's the opposite of accidental complexity? There's accidental complexity and
intentional complexity.
Intentional. It's not the word I was looking for, but yeah, basically complexity that exists because it's complex. And I feel like RxJS does not have a lot of accidental complexity. I mean, obviously it has a bit because every system does, but I'm just saying it doesn't have a lot, because the reason you need to understand cold and hot observables is because that actually changes things. It changes how things are going to operate. And by just relying on, like, let's say this is like the thing about promises versus observables. By just saying, oh, but it's so much easier with an async function. I just await this and then I do it. It's like, okay, but now add error handling. Oh, I just add a try catch to this. Okay, now it looks a little more complex. It's like, okay, now add cancellation because you don't want to update state and you don't want to have a memory leak. It's like, okay, well, I'll just add a Boolean that says, am I logged in or not? And I'll add a place that I can call this to say that I'm not. And it's like, okay, great. Now that function looks a lot less simple than it did when you said, oh, but it's way simpler to use await, async await or whatever. You know what I mean? And so it's a matter of, okay, you're just not dealing with the complexity that you need to. You're leaving stuff out. And I feel like cold and hot observables is an aspect of that. It's like, okay, you get into it and you're like, I get RxJS because I subscribe to state, and then I just get this event that happens every time, and then I dispatch actions sometimes to like change it. That's actually more flex than observables, but there's something that changes the action. Well, but cold and hot is like, oh, but when you subscribe and then I subscribe, we need to know the difference there. Are we subscribing to the same thing? Do we need to like restart something else? And so just by like ignoring it, like going like, oh, that's something I don't want to deal with. You're somewhere you're over complecting something else. You're like, oh, to deal with the fact that all observables are hot, we're going to like make complex things now, as opposed to like the more elegant idea of like, oh, just understanding the difference between cold and hot.
Well, so the way promises manage like being cold or hot, like a promise itself would be hot. As soon as you instantiate a promise, it's off, it's going, it's hot, right? But the way you would do a cold approach to a promise is you'd have a function that returns a promise, right? So you just call that a promise factory. So then the promise is, this is cold because until it's called, it's not actually instantiated. And this is the same concept going on in hot and cold observables. The difference with RxJS is hot and cold observables look very much the same, to the point where
Right. They have the same API.
Yeah, and they look. I had gone for a significant time in RxJS without realizing, there's a distinction here even. So
right,
but
that kind of goes back to the idea of like, that goes back to the idea of you shouldn't have to, right? I have an observable, I subscribe to it, and it tells me, when to change things, and you shouldn't need to know based on that. But the only time you do need to know is when you're like, oh, but I want this guy to have the same to respond to the same events. You know what I mean? When you want something to be hot, you want to be like, hey, I want these two things to like go together. I don't want them to have separate instances. But that's the only time it really starts to matter, right?
Yeah, but let me throw this in your head, Adam, just to see where it goes. Like, what if all observables were hot?
Yeah.
And you just called a function to create them if you wanted a cold one. Mm-hmm. Like, would that be that much different of a world? I don't think so. Like, it would be essentially, the same thing.
So all observables are hot, and you just get a different like way of creating an observable that would say this is cold.
Yeah, like the same way you would work with promises, right?
Right. Isn't that how it works? Isn't that kind of how it works? Like, isn't it basically like there are, by default, technically, well, I guess maybe not by default, because if you think about how a component creates, but like there are certain things that create observables, and some of them create hot observables and some of them create cold observables, right? Like it is kind of that already.
Well, so the classic example I think of this is the HTTP client in Angular, which is like if you call get, that is a method on the HTTP client that is returning to you a cold observable, which means like once you have a reference to that, nothing's happened. You just have kind of defined essentially a function that you will call when you hit subscribe. So until you hit subscribe there, nothing's happened. As soon as you subscribe, that's what's going to go out and make the HTTP call and then come back. Mm-hmm. But what if you just had, what if that was just,
what if you're like, no, make a new observable if you want another one. Because this one is hot. Why are you subscribing? Why are you unsubscribing and subscribing to the same one? Or having multiple people subscribe to the same one. Just make a new one every time.
It's a method that returns a function, which when called will return an observable, which are always hot.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything wrong with that.
I feel like there's probably a reason why they did go this way.
Yeah, but we need to call Ben Lesh.
I know.
And say like, hey man, what's the deal with cold observables? Why don't we just make them all hot?
I think it might be more of a reactive X thing, or maybe not. No, I don't think so. I don't think so actually, because in a lot of other languages, I think streams are always hot, and you just, if you want cold, you instantiate them. I don't know. I'm ashamed to say I don't know enough about any other language to say whether or not that's true.
I off the top of my head, I can't think of anything wrong with that approach. Like, why not?
Yeah, I'll tweet at Ben. I'll tweet at Ben later and see. I feel bad about tweeting about this stuff though, because it always feels kind of like a troll thing to do, like asking Brandon about boilerplate or something like that.
I feel like and you might be right. I wonder if this is just a case of like a legacy decision. Do you know what I mean? Maybe not. Maybe there's a perfectly good reason for
I feel like there's probably a good reason. I just can't see it immediately.
But I wonder if it's just a matter of like, well, intervals always work that way. We can't change it now. I wonder. Oh, I'm so curious now. Now I'm just going to be Googling like mad for why do we need cold observables at all? There's got to be a reason, right?
Yeah. I don't know. It's weird. It's very weird. It's very odd. But
what I think we should do? We should write our own observable library. And our own like piping mechanism, and it should all be based off async generators, and just see what we get, see how far we get. Just be like, hey, we got pretty far, and then we'll be like, what would solve this problem? A cold observable.
Probably.
Yeah, that'd be it.
Probably.
That's been my experience so many times. I'm like, I'm going to remake something that's totally already made, and it's going to be better and smaller. And then you get to a point and you're like, I am totally remaking what is already made, because they realized all this stuff before.
Now I see why they needed that.
That makes sense now.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I don't know. I feel like I need to. I don't know. That would be definitely an interesting undertaking. But yeah, I'm just. I don't know. I just thinking about those things recently. So
I love it.
yeah,
I love it.
I don't know, man. We've been going at it for like an hour and a half now.
Do you want to talk about Zalgo?
Well, what's that?
You want to talk about Zalgo?
What's Zalgo?
What's Zalgo? Summoning Zalgo. Exactly, man. So there's this thing that like, so you know how I was talking about you can have this component and it doesn't matter whether the data is coming asynchronously or synchronously, you just get to make your component and it doesn't matter. You can use a provider to decide whether it's going to be async or sync.
Sure. Yeah.
There's this concept of Zalgo, which is, I don't even know if it's somebody made up a word or it's an old ancient god from Cthulhu or something. But it's like somebody wrote an article way, way back, like 10 years ago or more even, about like summoning Zalgo is when you have an API that will either do something synchronously or asynchronously, but you don't know which. Like as a consumer of the API, you don't know whether it's going to be async or sync. And it's like you have to kind of write in this way. And it's like opens up this Pandora's box of like all these things that can go wrong.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, though, just by luck or whatever of the design, RxJS doesn't really have this problem because you can like, because the way you use RxJS, you kind of like subscribe and you don't expect the very next line of code to be run synchronously to have like whatever happened in that subscribe. It doesn't really have this problem that Zalgo might be summoned. And so you can have these interfaces when you're using RxJS, you can have these interfaces that don't know whether it's synchronous or synchronous, and it doesn't matter. And that's what I love about it. So you can have this like, you know, React component that says you just treat it like it's a synchronous render, which is what React wants you to do. Right. But it actually is getting its data asynchronously, but it doesn't need to know anything about that. And that's awesome. So you basically embracing Zalgo instead of summoning it.
Yeah. So dealing again, forgive me because I haven't gotten into asynchronicity at all in React. So or the what's the new API called? Suspense for kind of handling it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You know, we should totally talk about that if you've got time.
You can talk about it. I can't contribute anything to it. But
you want to burn this episode early though because we've been going for a while. But
no, I'm good to keep going if you are, man.
Everything I've said about like React needing synchronous updates based on discrete state changes, kind of goes out the door when we start to talk about suspense and concurrent mode, right? But not at all. But like it seems like it would. But I'm here to tell you, no, it's all the same. Because like basically there's this whole thing of suspense. And suspense currently, at least, is based on the idea that you move, like, whether this component has the data it needs to render or whatever, or if the component is ready or not, outside of the components. You can say, like, you know, this is where you put your spinner is basically up where the suspense component decides whether you show it or not. And then you can coordinate and stuff with that. And all that is based around this very clever idea of throwing a promise. It's like an error happens, sort of, or you're basically, for whatever reason, you know, the component code hasn't loaded yet, so we don't know what this component actually is going to be yet, or the data hasn't loaded yet. I'll just throw a promise, and when that promise resolves, I'll let you know. I'll resolve that promise when we're ready, and then render that. And until then, let whatever suspense component is above me in the tree decide what to do. But I'm going to throw this component, and it's fine. And like it's exactly the same. Basically, it doesn't give you any asynchronous behavior at all in your component. It basically just says, if you're not ready yet, throw an error, which happens to be a promise instead of an error, and then when you resolve that error, that promise, we'll try again. And that's all it is. It's like, so we're just going to throw everything away as if we're going to be halfway through a function even, and that's where some things can be complicated because you have to take into account. I could be halfway through a function and it will stop and then it will restart later on. And so you can't have any state that this kind of goes back to that idempotent state. You can't have any state that like would matter because of that. Like you should be able to get halfway through a function, stop, throw, and then restart later. And that shouldn't break anything. Anyway. And so it still depends on this synchronous render. Still like, nope, if you're ever going to get to the end, it's got to be synchronous. There's nothing changes about that. And then same with like the, data fetching for suspense. Is that what they call it now? I can't remember what they call it now. Data fetching for suspense, which has been this long thing that's like it never going to happen. It's kind of like Angular 11 or whatever it was, or Ivy. It's just like it's gone on so long that like, now people are like, I don't know.
It's a meme.
Yeah, and like and then they announced like server components, and it's like, oh, we don't even need that other stuff if we got server components. And so now is it ever going to come out? But it has to, because like things like Apollo and stuff are based on it or have it taken into account. Anyway, this whole thing that I won't get into, but all that does is it basically says, so outside of the component, you want to load your state, and then your state can access it inside the component. And it basically, it ends up being very similar to what I was talking about by using RxJS. You basically get to write your component as if it has the state. It's like, I know it has the state. I'm going to use this resource, is a word that became popular in this. I'm going to use this resource, which I'm going to pull the state out of, and then I'm just going to use it synchronously. And I know it's going to be there because as soon as I pull it out, if it's not there, it throws an error, which happens to be a promise. And then when it does, the data does come in, we're just going to try this again. And they always say, like, don't rely on that being the mechanism, because they're not sure that's the best thing. So don't actually like code your stuff to throw a promise. But anyway,
interesting.
But the idea there is basically exactly what you already get with RxJS. Is this synchronous? Is the data already here? I pull it in. And if it's not here, I wait until it is here, and then I pull it in. And like making a concurrent mode data fetching for suspense thing with RxJS is super simple. It's like you literally get to say, you know, make it a behavior subject. Check. Do I already have state? Yes. Okay, then go ahead. If I don't have state, you know, what's the function? It's like in the new Rx, it's like next value, on next value, and it returns a promise or something like that. I can't remember what it's called, the with next value or whatever the method is. But it basically says, as soon as you get a next value, you get a promise out of that, and it'll resolve when the next value in the observable comes in. And then you just use that. And then everything just happens the same. It's like so easy with RxJS.
Oh, you mean like the two promise replacements? They're coming out.
7.
It's like so.
There's one that's like right before it completes, and there's one that's just like the next value, and it would be the next value when you want.
So the this is like this. People think that I went looking into this because I've had this whole thing on Twitter a couple times now. Like, promises are not obsolete in Angular. Sometimes they should be promises and not observables. Is like this spiel I have. But anyways, like people saying, well, two promise is going away, because I'm like, well, you can always like switch from one to another. But like right now, to convert an observable to a promise, it must complete. And it's going to, the promise is going to resolve with the last emitted thing before it completed, right? So you always had to do, if you had some observable that didn't complete for some reason, you always had to like slap a take one on there and then call to promise,
right? Which
was kind of a pain. So they're changing it in 7 to be like.
That's kind of an interesting thing. Is it a pain to just say take one?
It kind of is. It kind of is. Like it sucks to have to do.
It's one of those things. I find it's like, I find it's one of those things though that like sometimes we exaggerate the trouble to make a point. You're like, oh, and then you got to add a take one, and it's this kerfuffle, and I don't know. Sometimes we exaggerate.
Well, you got to pipe and then take one, and then you got to promise. It gets long.
There was this like distinction that was hard to make. It was like, well, when should this promise actually run?
Yeah,
should it?
It's very unintuitive for someone to be like, oh, I converted to a promise, why isn't it resolving? Well, because you didn't complete. And it's like, oh, well, what does completing really mean? And you get into all this other stuff. But so the RxJS 7 stuff looks a lot better, because you can say, if you want the take one behavior where you just take the first thing, that goes to like take next emission and complete with that, or resolve with that. That's what that one method is. And the other one is like kind of behaving as it does now, which is only resolving on complete and then taking the last emitted before completing. So it looks cool. but
yeah,
sorry.
My point about that's cool. My point about the promises and stuff was just that like everything I said about React expecting your components to be synchronous renders based on discrete state doesn't change, even when you add concurrent mode and add suspense and stuff. It really doesn't change anything about that. That's just like for the framework, and it really is a framework. People are like, React's not a framework, it's a library. You're wrong, actually. It's a full-on framework ever since they added hooks. So
interesting.
So take that hot take, lukewarm take.
Well, so like the component example we had at the very beginning, like pure driven completely by props, I feel like I'm in the same world as what you're describing. Because like it doesn't matter to me, like a presentational component, it doesn't matter to me if some asynchronous thing caused it to happen or what's going on upwards in the tree, right? Like
Yeah, well, I mean, if you've got
Give me props. Here's your job.
if you've got a stateless component that only deals with props,
Yeah.
what can you even do asynchronously? You can't, right? You just are like, well, this is my render. You've
Yeah.
made what they call a calculation function, right? All it does is like, based on my input, I am going to give you output.
Time to memoize it and get it out there.
If React as a framework accepted an async function as a component, that would be totally different. Then I'm sure that would open a Pandora's box of hilarity. But
yeah, that'd be weird.
Yeah, like there's nothing you can do in that. It's just like, yep, you have to be render. You have to make a synchronous render, because if you make it, if you do anything else in that function that isn't a synchronous render, it's gonna fail. Actually, it's probably just gonna error.
Yeah, I think I don't know. To me, it feels like there's some strength in that pattern then, because like I don't know. I'm like I said, I'm looking to bring RxFire into my project at some point, so I can get like the live updates kind of deal going on. And yeah, I mean, like it feels like because of the pattern I went with, like things are driven by props. I don't have to touch that anymore. I can like we talked about with the modules and tests. Here's my presentational component. Let me put something on top. Like right now, I'm hard coding. That's like a kind of crappy module because I gotta like re-release every time I add a new check mark to my calendar, which is fine. Like it's not great, but it's fine. And but switching that up, I feel like I just have to adjust that little piece. Say okay,
well, and that's the beauty of it, right? When you do change that and refactor that so that it's not hard coded, you don't have to go into every one of your components and change something. You just like change that little piece that you had, because you've got nice isolation, you've got nice separation of concerns, you've got nice all that jazz, right? Yeah, that's you're doing it right, my man. Doing it right.
Oh, thanks, man. I'm just enjoying it. Like this is kind of fun.
I have this theory that like every framework can be like abstracted into this like UI layer, which is like where the framework lives, and then this middle layer, which is like the store, let's say. And the store, no matter what you're using, whether it's like NgRx or like Redux or MobX or whatever, it can always be wrapped in this, what they call the facade pattern in Angular, where it's like, all I'm going to do is I'm going to have methods that I can call and different states that I can subscribe to and derive different states from those as well.
Yeah.
And
whether it's an observable or a callback or a promise, it's
right. Well, I feel like it kind of has to be observables in the end, though, right? Because you need the ability to say, I'm going to update more than once. Like a promises just won't work, because it's like, okay, well, promises work on that pull kind of thing. Like you said, it's like, I'm going to give me the values. Okay, you got it. And then it's done. There's no like, oh, wait, and now this one, and now this one.
Well, yeah. Well, going back to like the complexity thing, I was talking with Craig Spence on the show a couple of weeks ago. It was like, well, we were talking about like building things with ASTs versus string manipulation or regex. Like the perfect solution for some of these things exists no matter what method you use. But if you're using ASTs, it might take you 5 lines. If you're using regex, it might take you like 100. If you're using string manipulation, it might take you 1,000. Like it's about finding the best tools for the situation. I think to date, observables are the most robust tool. The ones that give you the most precision. And the ones that allows you to expertly deal with any situation.
I agree. And what do you think the cost is of that, though?
It's the developer payment, I think.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. It's that ramp up time, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like you have to learn. You have to get used to it. You have to be able to read it, because a lot of people are like, well, when I look at RxJS code, I've heard a lot of people say to me something along the lines of, I look at RxJS code and it just looks like gobbledygook. Like it's like, I have no idea what's going on in this function. But like, as soon as you're used to Rx, it's even easier than other functions, because you're like, I can just read this like a sentence. I'm going to take this, I'm going to map it into this, I'm going to transform it into this, I'm going to reduce down to this value, and then I'm going to emit on every even one. You know what I mean? Like you can just read it once you get the idea.
Yeah.
Hello.
You've got a little one broken. If you can say hi, Adam.
Hi.
Sorry, I thought the door was locked. I'm surprised they let me go this long though, without coming in. But you want to say hi?
Hi. We're just shilling for ratings now. You know what would make this podcast even better? A cute kid.
A cute kid. AV. Hey, can you go to mommy? You got a foe? Yeah. Show mommy. I love you. Sorry. So get off here, kid. I'm podcasting.
I'm podcasting.
Sorry. What was the point you were making at the end there?
I was just saying, like, the cost of RxJS is like an initial cost, and it is a real cost that you can't deny. Like, you've got to learn it, you've got to get used to it, you got to be able to read it. But once you can read it, it makes everything so much simpler, and you start to think like, well, this would be a lot simpler if we used RxJS. Oh, this would be a lot simpler if you just used RxJS. But there's this real world cost of, like, you gotta, if you're the RxJS guy on a team and nobody else is with you, you're like, okay, guys, we need to switch to RxJS, and everyone's like, no, we're not.
It's a hard thing as a contractor, and you've been in this world too. It's like you should use RxJS, but it's hard to say you should all spend a year trying to figure this out, like I did, so we can write better code.
Get it, man. You're gonna think it's great. I know, and they're like, really? I actually did this once. I was working on a client. And I was like, okay, we're going to get this started. We're going to like RxJS it up. Is everybody cool with that? And they're like, okay, sure. As long as you're there to guide us. None of us have ever done it before. I'm like, cool. And then I got transferred off the project.
Whoops.
I said to the new person coming in, I'm like, okay, you haven't gone too far. Feel free to get rid of RxJS. Whoops. Feel free to get rid of RxJS because I expected to be on that project for a long time. And I didn't think like, I was going to ease everybody into it. We were going to have lessons every week and we were going to like get into it and stuff. And he's like, well, I'm sure I can figure it out. And I honestly I've never talked to them since. I honestly have no idea how that project went, but I'm worried that I screwed them over because I was like, let's use RxJS, got it started, and then left. I've no one to guide you but the videos on the internet.
Yeah, I've actually never like regretted bringing in RxJS. It's more like a hesitancy. I always wonder if I'm overthinking it, but I don't know.
I've never regretted it either. I mean, if you're going from that sense, I don't think it's ever been a bad decision to bring in RxJS. I just find people are really resistant to it. But almost everyone, everywhere that I've worked with that we've like after a while has been like, oh yeah, RxJS is awesome, and they become RxJS people.
Well, I feel like too. There's a lot of value in on the Angular side of things, tools like NgRx, which if like it reduces the amount of RxJS code you have to write. I think at the end of the day, because it enforces like a pattern. And it also
you're like now you're just writing NgRx code though, right?
Kind of, but I mean, at the end of the day, we can get into this. There's a whole thing here, but it's like that. At the end of the day, the function, the fundamentals of this are strong. It's all just functions, with very small, smallly scoped functions that's like comprise everything of NgRx. But like putting that aside though, at least when you get the observables out of this engine that you have very strict rules around, it's also in a state where it's always hot and it's always emitting with a behavior strategy. Which if you have that consistency to your RxJS code, like I think a lot of it is there's so many dimensions to RxJS that you could get bogged down with, like hot and cold, behavior strategy versus replay strategy versus the vanilla strategy. I don't even know what you call it, and all these other things. And if you could just flatten that down a little bit, like so you can get the real value without like sometimes you really need to split those out, like what we were talking about earlier. But most of the time, like just always sticking with hot and a behavior strategy, like that's jumping into NgRx very early. That's what I was used to, and that's that. In some ways, that may have caused some of my confusion around RxJS because I was like, it always is like this, right? Oh right. no, that was hot and behavior emissions. So I guess I gotta learn the other stuff now. But
what's kind of interesting about that is that all could sort of be reduced down to the flux pattern, right? Like, because it's not the RxJS that we really like. What we really like is this idea of state that I can subscribe to and actions that I can call that like possibly change that state, possibly synchronously, possibly asynchronously, but it doesn't matter. That's kind of what we like, which is really the flux pattern. And then the implementation can be NgRx and RxJS and whatever.
Well, I need to get into Flux, but the big thing I love about NgRx is actually thinking of your entire application as simply an action stream, with like that's the spine of your app, and everything else is just like a nervous system built on top of that spine,
Yeah.
right? So
If I had a complaint for NgRx though, I would say
uh-huh.
that it kind of abstracts away a lot of the ideas, right? You kind of have this like, okay, well, we're going to push our effects here, we're going to push our reducers here, and it's like, oh, do you really need that? Like, I want to see. Here's what I haven't seen yet. I haven't seen reducers, and this stretches to Redux and NgRx and anything that follows anything. I haven't seen reducers that do much other than update state. Like that, like couldn't just be, a mutation that happens to make something. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing been complicated in reducers. So what's the point of them almost? You know what I mean? Like you can just
no.
And then
they're complete implementation detail in my mind. Like the action stream is the only thing that really matters. Like what you happen to do in your reducer, or even what you happen to do in your state, completely irrelevant at the end of the day. Like that just depends on how you happen to implement it. It's your action stream, and then whatever's happening between like the backside of your selector.
Well, and
like
that's what I was going to say too. Is selectors, arguably, in my opinion, the best part of NgRx, all have to do with synchronous state, though. Like, I want to derive asynchronous state based on the state. You know what I mean? I don't want to say, I don't like it always, a selector always has to be synchronous state. So you've got state and you derive synchronous state from that state. So you get your derivation of state. But I want it to be asynchronous because I want to say, I want to be able to like look at the state and say, hey, that's ID 11. Oh, ID 11 changed to ID 12. Doesn't matter how ID changed at all. I just know it changed to 12 now. So I'm going to fetch some data and I'm going to put that, and now I have new state for my thing. Because, but in NgRx and Redux and whatever, I have to be like, okay, no. In the actions is where I'm going to do that. I'm going to be like, oh, this was called and it's going to change the ID. So then I'll also dispatch an action that's going to change this other state. It's like, no, I just want to observe the state. I just want to look at that state and say, oh, that changed, so I'm going to change asynchronously. And you can't do that in NgRx or Redux, and I don't like that.
Oh, I think you actually could.
Well, I mean, could in what way? Could in like breaking out of the right way of doing it, though?
I don't think so. I've talked to Mike Ryan now about this a while back, and I talk with Branton a lot, but I don't think it would be weird to be like, it might be weird. There's probably a lot of footguns around this, but you could. So an effect in RxJS is essentially you start. The idea is you start with some observable, and then it's essentially an operator. You're taking that observable and turning it into a new observable of actions, right? But I think you could easily do it where, like, normally you wait for an action to be dispatched and you trigger off of that. Like, that's your starting point, and then you pipe on stuff and you eventually get to it. I think you could just as easily start with your state and then have a selector from that. So you're essentially, like you're talking about, let me wait until I hear a 12 here.
I mean, I can assume how you would do it in an effect. For example, you'd take like a with latest from, and you'd pull in your state from the store, and you'd say, okay,
well, you
with
could
this,
also
now
do,
I'm going to get an observable, and then from there I'm going to dispatch actions. And I just don't think that's the encouraged way. Like, I could see how you could do it, but I feel like you'd be like breaking the rules.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with triggering an effect from something that's not specifically an action. There's definitely nothing against there's nothing against it in the API. I don't think there's anything like what's the right word? Kent and I were talking about this a little bit, like the religious aspect of it. Heretical. There's nothing. I don't think there's anything heretical about it either. So
I want you to bring that up with some people then, because I feel like it would be, but
I'll ask them.
Maybe I'm wrong.
Like specifically, the example you're talking about is kind of interesting because you could actually listen to that, throw a buffer count 2 on it, so you could listen to the last 2 things and say, well, listen to the last 2 things. If you ever increment once, do this. If that ID goes up twice or something, I don't know, do this instead. I feel like that would be fine. I don't know.
So that's interesting, because see, where I always saw it was like, it was always in like the facade pattern then. So somebody would be like, okay, well, we dispatch actions in the store, but then we like pull the state that we need, like in this case, ID 11. And then in the facade area still, like I'm no longer in NgRx store, that's where I would like make another observable that just fetches based off this ID changing. And then the thing that I offer to the component to subscribe to is just this,
Yeah.
but there's like a step between the store in the facade, and then
Yeah.
other people
I
would
don't
be like,
know. I
facades are
don't.
bad.
Yeah. I'm not big on facades for similar reasons, but um, yeah, I think there's some helpful patterns there. Like, it would be interesting to see. Like, a lot of times when you talk about facades in NgRx, it's because you're like putting a more easy API on top of it, on top of like this weird stuff that's NgRx. But I think again, this is like some place where you've needlessly complected your code base by putting that facade in there versus just having your engineers learn it. Like really learn NgRx, and then there's a lot more things you can do by just passing around actions and selectors rather than always
For
having to put
me,
up that facade in front.
I think the facade is about isolating, right? It's about saying the components have an interface that they can have, and it's
Yeah.
just going to be a very simple interface. I have state that I can subscribe to, and I have methods that I can call that are going to like possibly change that state, like I said, or either synchronously or asynchronously, but it doesn't matter. I just have
Mm-hmm.
state I subscribe to and methods that I call. And then within that, I can use NgRx, or I can use just RxJS by itself, or I can use anything else as long as it returns some sort of observable where they
Yeah. Yeah.
should.
Yeah.
I feel like this is just about like isolating, and so
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
can be like, oh, okay, it's not about making it simpler necessarily, but it's about making sure that I don't have to worry about that. I have black box that I understand my interface, and everything inside there doesn't matter. And so you
Yeah.
could swap out NgRx with, I don't know what
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Well,
other
I think
NgRx.
I reached out to Tom Burleson about this like years ago, um, because I think like at the end of the day, he was kind of the first person really pushing for the facades. I feel like the adapter pattern may be like a better way of looking at it, because like the facade pattern is kind of like you're given a consistent API to some complicated stuff happening behind it.
Mm-hmm.
The adapter pattern is very similar. It's like, well, here's a consistent API, and we can plug in whatever we want into this. Like you said, it could be NgRx, it could be some service in a subject, or NgRx component store. Doesn't matter. We're putting this adapter layer up so that we can change out what's behind it.
Mm-hmm.
If we ever need to. There's a lot of value to that. I think 100%.
I don't understand the difference.
Well, so
like in
I
my
don't know.
mind, you've got a store, you got an NgRx store, then you got some code in between there, and then you got a component. And like whether we call it a facade or an adapter, what
I think the adapter implies that whatever's on the other side of it can be a separate implementation could be plugged in instead, right? A facade to me seems more tightly coupled to whatever's behind it. Like it's something that would only make sense in the context of the thing it's facading, right? So, and that's the context I normally see this being used is like people don't want to have to learn NgRx, or they don't want all their teams to have to learn it. So maybe by putting up a facade, everyone else can just use it like it's normal Angular service, and that's true. It's definitely true. But yeah, I don't think there's ever any intent to like do something different behind that. I think the adapter would imply more that like we're adapting some API that our components all need that wouldn't be driven by NgRx. Like most of the time when I see NgRx, it's a very specific formula for the facade. It's like any action that you could call, there's actually just a method on this facade class that's going to go out and actually call that action or dispatch that action. And anything you could select from this slice of state is a method that returns that selector. Like it's a very strict thing, and I don't think that's the API most people would choose to make if anything could be behind this wall, right? So I don't know. Am I making sense or not?
Well, I don't understand, like, because you were talking about how it was tightly coupled to the this facade is tightly coupled to NgRx.
Mm-hmm.
But wouldn't an adapter by its very nature also be very tightly coupled to NgRx, because you are adapting NgRx to the expected API? So I don't understand how they wouldn't be tightly connected. I feel like I'm missing something.
Maybe. Yeah. So I don't know. A facade, I think, like I described, most of the time, a method that maps to a dispatch, or here's an observable that maps to a select store.select kind of implementation. The way an adapter would probably look is you'd say instead, well, what are my components needs? Like you could make an adapter specifically for a component where, hey, this component needs to get the person's name. It needs to be able to change that person's name. It needs to be able to do X, Y, Z, all these other things, right? So you could have some adapter, and you think about this maybe as just as a TypeScript interface at first. How do I define what this adapter looks like? It's going to be these things. And you say, well, how can I fill out that interface? How can I implement that interface? Oh, we could, like, assuming there's no architecture set up in your app currently, you could say, well, I could use NgRx and just, figure out how that's going to work and have some implementation of that adapter interface that's going to come through and, plug those NgRx things, like take the selectors and the dispatches and whatever combination of those you need and just plug it into this component. Or I could say, well, maybe a behavior with the subject's the better implementation. And then you could say, without changing the interface or the component in any way, let's implement that behind the scenes instead, right?
Quick question. Which were you talking about, a facade or an adapter?
That's an adapter.
You sure?
Yes! It's like...
okay, then I guess I'm all for adapters, because that's exactly what I would want, right? Like even when we were talking about NgX with when we were talking about RxJS with React, I was saying I want to make a custom hook, and then I want the provider to provide whatever that's going to be. And so the component has needs. Like the component is like, I need a list of users.
I got needs.
I need a list of users, and I need to be able to update the name on any one of these users. Give me that, and I don't care how you implement it. And then I want an adapter or a facade. I still don't really understand the difference.
Well, okay, an adapter you make for the
give me those things, and then I don't care what you do behind there.
Exactly. I think an adapter you make for the component. I think a facade you make for the whatever it's for NgRx, right? I think that's maybe the difference.
I don't get it.
No. Damn it. Well, sorry.
I'm sorry. No, I apologize. I feel like I'm like I'm listening to the words you're saying, and I'm trying to picture it in my head, but I really can't see a difference. And I think I need to see code maybe or something, because I really don't understand the difference between a facade and an adapter, and I apologize for being a little dense.
It's probably me.
No.
But dude, we've been going at for 2 hours now.
Yeah. Maybe we should call it a day, I suppose. It was great being on your show. I appreciate being on the same level as Kent C. Dodds somehow. Just being, woo. I love it. So
yeah, that was really cool. It was definitely a huge treat to have Kent on. But now it's I feel like I can get Adam on the show, for example, because he's like, oh, that's that Kent C. Dodds show.
Well, this show is important. I know I've been on it twice before, but now it's important.
Now it's something for the LinkedIn profile, right?
Exactly. And now I'm putting it up for sure.
Yeah. Well, Adam, thank you so much for your time and for talking about this stuff. I'm sure I'll be coming to you with more React thoughts and am I doing this right kind of things going forward.
I sadly I could talk about React and JavaScript all day. So I'm here for you anytime you want.
And the last 2 hours are testament to that.
Yeah, for sure. And especially because I'm so rambly too. We went in 20 different directions, because I'm willing to talk about anything. Yeah,
I know. I loved it, man. Well, thank you so much. And everyone, thanks for joining us. And we'll see you next week. Bye.